Hello. Thank you very much for coming to talkPOPc. My name is Dena Shottenkirk, and we know each other, but we should reintroduce ourselves. Your name?
My name is Martin Nitsche.
All right, and I'm from Brooklyn College, right?
I'm from Prague, the Institute of Philosophy.
Wonderful. So I'm going to give a kind of, just for the audience here, sort of a setting story about what we're doing here and why we're having this conversation. So this is part of talkPOPc, Philosophers Ontological Party Club, and we have come here to Prague, right, to do a collaborative project with you, with Martin, right, on the topic of art as cognition. And that topic is the third one that we're doing for talkPOPc. And so let me kind of reiterate sort of what that organization is. So I started that organization several years ago, and it's both an art and philosophy conversation that aims to kind of, I was going to say rejuvenate, right, was the word that came to my head, but in some ways that's the right term, right? Both the practices in art and the practices in philosophy to emphasize and reiterate the role of conversation, because it has seemed to me that the flaw in both of those disciplines is that it sort of encourages a kind of solipsistic narcissism on the point of the speaker and a refusal to recognize the kind of communal role that thought plays in people, right? So my version of it is that with both art and with philosophy, that what we're doing is having conversations with each other. And as we have these conversations, we build up the thought between us. So it's not thoughts that I own or thoughts that I have proprietary ownership over. It is my contribution to an ongoing and very fluid thing that happens between us, right? So I wanted to say that as a kind of introductory model, and then to say a kind of almost confession, right? So the confession is that I'm an analytically trained philosopher. You're a continental philosopher, and we think that the two shall never meet, right? That's the general. It's like it's a warring of forces on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Yeah. And in reading your stuff, right, I've come to realize that we're talking about the same thing, but from our two different traditions. And so it's become a very interesting conversation between us that we've only begun, right? You came to New York in June, yeah, right? And we only met briefly there, and you did the talkPOPc event there, which was wonderful.
It's
in Bryant
exciting,
Park,
yeah.
Right? It was exciting, right?
Yeah.
And so as we are doing this, we have become to realize that we're saying the same thing from two radically different points of view. So this conversation here in some ways is sort of an exploration, sort of and I'll hand it over to you, sort of to take the helm here and to talk about, I guess you think the same thing, and it's a very kind of confusing moment that we're in historically.
Yeah. I had the very same impression as you just described, that we are talking about the same theme, same ideas actually.
Yeah.
And even though the perspectives are slightly different, we are somehow searching the same. And that's great actually. And while we are searching for some bridges maybe between the continental and the analytical traditions, I think the idea of conversation could be one of them, since in my tradition and in your tradition we have the same roots, the Platonic idea of dialogue, for example, and the idea that philosophy must be done in dialogue. It's, at least in the continental philosophy, we never abandoned this idea.
I think it's true.
And I know the great conversation of analytical philosophers too. So this is what somehow connects us. And then art, of course.
Yeah.
Since we both want to learn from artists, and we are not in dialogue only between us, but also with art and works of art.
Yeah, and I think that in some funny way that aesthetics, or the theory of art that we might actually be the avenue that we travel down in order to make that bridge between the two disciplines, right? In ways that we might not be able to accomplish with philosophy of mind or epistemology or philosophy of science or some other things. I think that that's probably the avenue that will show the frailties of both perspectives, right, and the strength that would happen in building a bridge between the two. Yes. I suspect that, but I don't think that we quite have this worked out. But I think it's sort of an exciting moment because I think we are going to work it out. You know, I do think we are going to work this out. So let me I'm going to refer back a little bit to your writing, if you don't mind, right?
Yeah,
so when you talk in your book, let me get the absolute proper title here, The Methodological Precedents of Intertwining.
It's a very continental title,
It's a very continental...
I'm sorry.
Right? Yeah. We would go 2.0. That's what we would do. So in that, you begin at one point to talk about, because you're talking about Husserl, right? And your sort of reinterpretation of Husserl, which is wonderful, right? And right before this, I want to say sort of what we said before this, that I remember, right, when I was a graduate student, having as my professor Virginia Held, right, who's feminist ethics, and how she was always talking about, no, Husserl, even though he's continental, Husserl's really good, right? And so as I was reading your work, I was going, I'm going to show this to Virginia, right? So anyway, so you talk about refusing to have a clear divide between the subject and the object. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it was Husserl's main point as he started phenomenology in the 1900s in his book Logical Investigations. Since what I like about him, that he was always looking for a new beginning of philosophy, like a new start, and he discussed this against actually his teacher Brentano, who was very interesting and influential and so on, but his theory of perception and cognition was based on this traditional, let's say, Cartesian strict division between subject and objects. And
can I interrupt for just a second? Yeah. And the Cartesian would always presuppose that the interiority gives you the truth, right? When you have a clear and distinct idea, for your interior perception, that gives you the truth.
And Husserl simply said it doesn't work. For example, if I have pain in my teeth, I somehow connect the pain with teeth, but it's not the teeth what hurts, it's somewhere else. So the interiority, the subjective ideas are it doesn't mean that there is a certainty of truth, and we have
that was what the Cartesian point always was, right? Exactly. You can't really trust the empirical world, but you can and your data from the empirical world you can't really trust, but you can certainly trust the interiority of your knowing something, right, clear and distinctly, right? And of course, analytic philosophy disagrees with that in many ways, right? The Cartesian point of view is rebelled against by most people. But so go on, sorry.
No, it's... For Husserl, the problem was the division.
Right.
Since he somehow wanted to do a monistic philosophy, a philosophy of lived experience. And we have just one experience in a way, which is multifaceted and multi-layered and so on, but it's one experience.
Does anybody ever connect Husserl to James?
Yeah. Actually, even Husserl himself, they knew. It's very similar.
When I was rereading your book, I was going, God, this is James. Experience, right? This sort of holistic experience. Yeah.
I think James knew about Husserl, and I think Husserl knew about James. I don't remember these historical
I don't
details.
remember the historical. facts either. Yeah.
There's a connection definitely.
But there's definitely a connection. Yeah. So I've come at this point, really kind of through the analytic method and particularly through science and all of the research that's gone on with vision science and particularly just perception. So my thought is much the same, right? That in that first 300 milliseconds, particularly of our just perception, we have both objective and subjective, right? So like at 50 milliseconds, you know whether or not the scene that you're looking at is stable or not stable, right? So that kind of should I fear it? Should I not fear it? Information is like immediately available to you, right? Also, so along with the disordered and ordered one, you have color, you have shapes, you have all kinds of unnamed things, but they are, look, the thing about empiricism, I think, that was always kind of wrong was that it saw the arrow going from the object to the person, right? So that it was completely passive in that way. I always think of empiricism, my visual picture is, did you ever have, when you were a child, or did your children ever have those super flat sponges that you then put into water and then they become dinosaurs? Did you ever see those, right?
Yeah,
so and I always thought that was the picture, of empiricism, like I am this flat sponge and then the data comes into me and then I'm, enlivened in that way. And of course that can't really explain the processing, right? When we just look at this, when we look at experience as this divide between the subject and the object, you fail to explain almost by definition the interaction between the two, right? And that's what you mean to explain, right? So I like a lot, that Husserl kind of went, oh, well, that was dumb. We don't want to do that, So
I actually use Merleau-Ponty notion of intertwining, which is exactly this, or very similar to the gist perception idea that.
Oh, I think it's probably true.
Somewhere, it's a primacy of intertwining. So. During the experience, within the lived experience, there is no division of subject and object.
Yeah, there isn't. This is also a made-up.
Secondary.
It's almost like this fiction that we've told ourselves, and then we try to explain the world according to this fiction.
Of course, it's well, this description which divides between subject and object, it works. I can say that. I'm here, right?
That's true.
And the cap is here, and there's a distance, but this all is secondary. This is not the root of perception and not the root of cognition either.
I think that's really right. I think that perception has at its root a marriage between the object and the subject, right? And that the two cannot ever be separated. I think that's the fact that we kind of have to focus on and deal with, right? And so how do we explain both perception and experience with these two married things at the beginning, right? And how do they untwine and then twine back? And so you have to think of them with this paradigm of a very fluid thing, right? Which is kind of the paradigm I've always thought of with talkPOPc, that there's a fluidity of things. There's a constant fluidity, right? I mean, we gather conversations, right? But we gather them in this very fluid pot, that we kind of are able to look at and stir, but kind of not,
And it brings a new light to Husserl's notion of phenomenological reduction, actually.
Yeah, would you talk a little about? Because I swear to God, I've always been very vague about that. So help me here.
Well, many phenomenologists, starting with Heidegger, criticized actually this reduction or reductions as something which concentrates only on subjectivity. They even criticize Husserl from being solipsistic. It's not true. The reduction is... I skip all the scholarly explanation of reduction, but I just tell how I see it. It's a reduction in the original sense of the word, which means like transiting the attention to some problem, like this Latin word reducere. Reduct means to translate the problem to a new to refocus actually the problem to a new domain. So I think what Husserl reduction does actually is that it focuses not on the division of subject and object, but on the intertwining, on this gist or this melting pot, as you named.
Okay, so there's almost two contradictory ideas I have here, so sort out which one is the right one. All right, so the reduction could either be a sort of, see, I always thought of it as focusing, right?
Yeah.
Almost like a focusing, right? So you focus on the temporal moment. That's one.
Not only temporal, you just leave the division between subject and object, and you focus into the middle, to the meeting point.
To the event itself, in some way.
Yeah.
Is that to the event itself, right? So that would be one idea, right? And that's kind of what I always thought.
And actually, Husserl calls this event the pure consciousness. That's.
Oh, see, I have a lot of separate trouble with that one.
Yeah,
but,
I know.
Yeah.
It's confusing.
Yeah.
Though, but.
But can we get this? So
Yeah.
that was one idea. So it's kind of like, the difference between, this is my analogy, right? The difference between peripheral vision, which is also complicated, and that sort of, that small part of your eyeball that actually focuses on things, right? So I thought of the reduction always as that, right? But then the other thing that you were saying there pulled me into your fuller title, transitive topological phenomenology. So if it's transitive, okay, so the transitive seems to be quite different, right? Transitive seems to be about the construction of meaning. So experience comes in one format to me, right? And then what I do as a way of understanding it is to reposition and to claim it as my own and to pass it through in that transitive way to somebody else so that the meaning retains its fluidity. So that was the other contradictory notion I had of reduction, which is correct.
The first one, I would say, but it's not that simple with transition and this transitive topological moment of phenomenology. It's the first step is the reduction, which means also, as I call it, restriction of the subject-object division. So after this methodical step of reduction, the division between subject and object is not valid anymore. Right?
Okay.
So you focus
So now you've got experience.
Yeah, you focus on lived experience, on intertwining, on, as you call it, gist of perception. Those are the roots of perception. And so this is Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and what I somehow, how I continue with this idea is that for me it's not a matter of cognition primarily, no perception, but orientation. So I try to understand it in more topological terms. So the meaning of or the sense of perception or sensation is not to conceive a meaning of experience. It's not to speak, but to orientate simply. Orientation is more important than logic, than language, and than knowledge, I would say.
But orientation always has it's my orientation, right?
Yeah, but within the world.
Right. So that has me in sort of like, I'm sort of like the middle of sort of the concentric circles, right? In that way, right? It's my orientation.
Not necessarily.
Okay, so tell me
Since when you do this reduction, you somehow disrupt the circle structure, the horizontal structure of your consciousness.
Yeah.
And in favor of a more layered way of experiencing, which is actually closer to the artist's viewpoint, as you call it.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there is an interesting and very famous description made by Husserl in Ideas 2, which is a description of touch. So you would say, I'm here, the hand is here, and I touch it. So it's like some distance and so on. And but he, after making the reduction, then you can say that you are also there where you touch yourself, that your body, which is extended in the space, has a layer of haptic sensing. It's a vivid body, and if you have this subjective centered type of orientation, the point zero is usually in your brain, right?
Yeah.
But if you restrict this distinction between subject and object, you now know that all your body is sensing. It's lived. It's
Yeah.
And if you touch your hand, then you somehow relocalize the brain to this spot, right? And Husserl describes this as a way of somehow creating new layers of experience. So now your experience doesn't have a structure of circles, of distances and different type. Of course, not only distances that are metric, but distances of meaning, like something is closer, more important, something is less important, and so on. So,
yeah, let me say two things about that. I think that when you say restriction, I hear in my brain elimination. And I know that you don't think that, right? I think that you mean a more nuanced kind of thing, right? But I keep going in my brain, right, to elimination, right? So let me just sort of take it there for a second. So, as I said, sort of, I do it from a sort of different perspective, where I'm doing it more from vision science. But if you capitalize on this distinction that's often made in vision science between low level and high level perception, right? That really is tracking in many ways the distinction between linguistically named experiences and non-linguistically named experiences. So when you were talking before about if you just think of experience as something that's centered in your brain, what you're really saying there is, I'm thinking of things that are linguistically described, semantically identified. This is a flower, this is a table, right? Which then puts the objects out there, right? Which then takes you back to that problem of how do I bring the perception of those objects into my subjective experience, right? But if you don't really divide entirely, like low level from high level, right? So high level is generally those semantic things, and low level are those generally non-semantic things, right? So I can see something and kind of recognize a shape, but I don't have to name it as a shape, right? I can recognize something as disordered, but I have to name it as disordered, right? So I can, in that way, experience those sort of low-level things that we often think of as sensations, right? So when you're talking about touching your hand, I don't really have names for each of those processes of my finger going into my hand, and yet I have the experience and the low-level perception of that stuff happening, right? So all of that stuff is experienced even though it's not named, right? So the range of things that are experienced is way huger than the range of things that are named.
Exactly.
Right?
And the centric horizontal structure of experiencing is connected to language, to high level perception. But those low level are, I think, the topological structure is different. It's more layers.
Yeah. So let me just maybe have a quick detour into topology, right? So topology is normally thought of like in computer science, right? Where you have sort of like little nodes, right? You have nodes and then connections between them, which is a lot like neural nets in that way, right? But I think that topology is also used in organizational structures where you think of the nodes as the goals, right? And the connections between them are the things that you have to do in order to get to the goal, right? So there's a sequence of events, right? That's why computer science uses it, because first you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and then you can get to A, right?
Yeah.
So it's a procedural thing. Now, I'm just not 100% sure if lived experience is that kind of sequencing of processes in quite the same way.
It's not.
Right, okay.
But there's different notion
Of topological.
of topology.
Yeah, I think so,
I would
yeah.
say
Yeah.
it has a tradition,
Yeah.
and it has a tradition in phenomenology too, which goes back to Heidegger, who actually, in his very late works, always emphasized that philosophy is a topology, a way of that the being with the big B, like being, the sense of all existence, should be localized. It's nothing general, it's nothing, well, as the old metaphysics told, general, hierarchic. It should be always localized. So he has this notion of a topology of being.
But you're thinking of the nodes as content, though, aren't you?
Yeah, but phenomenology is new. Physics and mathematics and this idea of topological space, and I think the variability of the topological space was interesting for them. The different ways of relations. For example, if you have two nodes, they are in some distance, but if you transform the space, they could be very close actually. And those are topological transformation of space. So this was, I think, inspiring for phenomenologists, that actually our
And that comes from Einstein's curvature.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see that.
And Einstein student named Hermann Weyl was a student of Husserl too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh? That's kind of interesting.
So he's the person who
I
connected
see. I see.
phenomenology.
So I see. Okay, so now you've got this kind of, not quite metaphorical, that's the wrong thing to say, but
Yeah, it's a picture of world which is transformative, changeable, but still related.
yeah.
So,
And fluid in the way that
fluid,
things are
exactly,
very context dependent and can change.
and you have to localize yourself within this world.
And that
that's
meaning
topology.
is that thing that can be, it's always being constructed on the fly. Right.
Yeah.
Which I know maybe right now at the end of our conversation is an odd time to bring it back to art, right?
Yeah.
But let me just do that quickly, right? So it seems to me, right, that one function that art has as a kind of way that we understand the world, as a kind of cognition, is that it, to use your language, it provides for those topological transitions. Like all of a sudden, this thing can actually mean that thing,
exactly.
and those two dots can be folded together, and all of a sudden you've gotten a new way of looking at the world, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I do that slightly differently, right? Because I'm doing the same thing, you're right, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm thinking about it in terms of low-level and high-level features of perception and the ontological constructing of objects. And so I think that what artists do is come in and reconstruct reality by basically framing off and throwing a lasso almost around a different kind of ontological space and kind of going, oh, it's going to be this. I'm going to point you to this, right? But what that does in that topological space is do sort of the curvatures of meaning. Now, this thing that never meant that over there now means this over here. And cool. Super cool.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, Martin, maybe now's the moment to, I was going to say end, but it really is beginning.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah, and beginning, exactly.
And beginning, right? Ending and beginning, because the two dots came together. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Wow, that's great.
Thank you too.